Hello, everyone. The moment your heart shatters because of a single sentence, when my daughter-in-law, in the home I paid for over 30 years, laughed and called me the unofficial maid. The room erupted in laughter, even from my own son, each chuckle slicing through decades of silent sacrifice. This isn't just a story of hurt. It's a journey of awakening for a woman in her golden years, uncovering a shocking truth and rewriting her own ending. If you've ever felt invisible in your own life, this story is for you. Please drop a comment below to let me know where you're watching from and share your own story. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt stories like this one. I spent my entire life giving love, time, money, myself, until one evening, surrounded by a table full of food I'd prepared, I heard words that broke me forever. The clink of crystal glasses still echoes in my mind, the soft hum of Frank Sinatra's jazz drifting through the house I'd paid for, mortgage payment by mortgage payment. The smell of the pot roast I'd seasoned at dawn, slow cooking while I ran errands for a dinner I wasn't even invited to, filled the air. I'd spent the morning at the grocery store, picking out the freshest vegetables, the best cuts of meat, because Emily, my daughter-in-law, had forgotten to tell me her parents were coming over. Once again, the house needed to look perfect, and once again, I was the one to make it so. I should have left. I should have seen what was coming when Emily's mother, Patricia, looked at me with that half-curious, half-condescending glance and asked, "And who are you?" Emily didn't hesitate. She laughed, like it was the funniest thing in the world, and said, "Oh, that's Dorothy, our unofficial maid. Keeps the house running." Everyone laughed. Patricia, her husband, their friends, and worst of all, my son, James. I stood there, holding an empty wine bottle I'd fetched from the basement, forcing a polite smile as the floor seemed to vanish beneath me, as my heart crumbled piece by piece. I excused myself, set the bottle on the counter, and walked slowly to my bedroom, my knees aching from years of standing, cleaning, and caring. Their laughter followed me down the hall. Not one of them, not even James, corrected her. No one said, "That's my mother." Not a single word. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the door I'd painted myself decades ago when we first moved in. It was a soft blue, chosen because James loved the color as a boy. I remembered the day I signed those mortgage papers, my name, my credit, my down payment, scraped together from years of working double shifts. James was just out of high school, a lanky teenager with big dreams and no Emily in sight. They had nothing. I gave them everything, my youth, my savings, my dreams of traveling to Paris or writing the novel I'd always talked about. And now, at 68 years old, with arthritis creeping into my hands and a lifetime of sacrifices behind me, I was the maid. The next morning, I woke with the same routine I'd followed for years. I made coffee, the old percolator hissing like a friend who knew all my secrets. I fed the cat, Muffin, who Emily pretended to love but never cared for. I stood in the kitchen, waiting, as I always did, for Emily to come downstairs. She appeared in her yoga outfit, eyes glued to her phone, not even a good morning. I'd spent years hoping for a kind word, a gesture of gratitude, but it never came. That morning, something inside me snapped. Not loudly, not violently, but with a quiet resolve. I reached into my apron pocket, pulled out the ring of keys, front door, back door, garage, mailbox, and held them out to her. "What's this?" she asked, her perfectly manicured brow furrowing. I smiled, a smile I hadn't felt in years. "Good luck paying the mortgage now." She blinked, stunned, her mouth opening but no words coming out. I walked past her, past the photos I'd framed of James's childhood, the furniture I'd chosen from secondhand stores to make the house a home, the walls I'd painted with colors that reminded me of hope. I took nothing but my purse and the wool coat I'd worn when I brought James home from the hospital 40 years ago. Its buttons worn, but still sturdy. I didn't say goodbye. James called my name as I opened the door, his voice sharp with confusion. I didn't stop. He ran after me, barefoot in the driveway, shouting, "Mom, what are you doing?" I kept walking, my sensible shoes clicking on the pavement. I didn't slam the car door. I closed it gently, calmly, the way you close a chapter. It wasn't rage or grief that drove me. It was clarity, the scariest thing of all, because clarity doesn't scream or beg. It just knows. And I knew, for the first time in my life, that I was done. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew where I wasn't staying. In the rearview mirror, I saw James standing in the driveway, frozen, his hands in his hair. He had no idea what he'd just lost, and neither did I, not yet. I drove through our small town, past the diner where I used to take James for pancakes, past the park where he'd learned to ride a bike, past the life I'd built brick by brick. My hands gripped the steering wheel, not out of fear, but out of determination. I was leaving, not just a house, but a version of myself I no longer recognized. That first night, I arrived at the small apartment left to me by my late sister, Helen. It wasn't freedom, not yet. It was silence, thick and heavy, settling over everything like dust. The apartment smelled of time. Old hardwood floors creaked under my weight. Yellowed wallpaper peeled at the edges, and the radiator groaned like it remembered better days. I dropped my bag on the kitchen table, its formica surface scratched from years of use, and stood there, unsure whether to cry or laugh. I did neither. I just stared at the cracked tiles, thinking of the home I'd walked away from. It wasn't a home anymore, not for me. The days that followed, I moved like a ghost. I slept on the couch, its springs digging into my back, because the bed frame in the bedroom was broken. I ate peanut butter sandwiches and canned soup warmed in a microwave that hummed louder than it should. My hands, once quick and strong, now moved slower, the joints protesting with every twist of a jar lid. I didn't call anyone, not because I had no one, but because no one called me. James didn't text, didn't email, not a word. Maybe Emily told him not to, or worse, maybe he just didn't care. I kept replaying that dinner, their laughter, the way James laughed. It wasn't just the words that hurt, it was the ease with which they erased me. I'd raised that boy alone after my husband left when James was 5. I gave up my job as a school secretary, my plans to go back to college, myself. I cleaned motel rooms at night, stocked grocery shelves at dawn, just to keep a roof over our heads. When my parents passed and left me an insurance payout, I used every penny to buy that house. A real home with a backyard for James to play in and a kitchen where I could teach him to make my mother's apple pie. I never asked him for rent, never made him worry about bills. Yet, in Emily's world, I'd become the help. At night, when the silence grew too heavy, I started writing in old spiral notebooks, the kind I used to buy for James in grade school, with bright covers that promised new beginnings. I filled pages with things I'd never said aloud, how I'd stand in the kitchen, waiting for a thank you that never came, how I'd cry in the garage when they went out to dinner without inviting me, their laughter fading as they drove away, how I'd pretend to be asleep so I wouldn't hear them mocking my favorite shows, like Murder, she wrote, in the living room I paid for. I wrote about the small hurts, too. The way Emily would rearrange my spice rack without asking, or how James stopped hugging me after he met her. The pages grew, not for anyone to read, but for me to release. I wasn't the maid anymore. I was Dorothy Thompson, a woman who'd given too much and was now taking herself back. I spent hours remembering the early years when it was just James and me. I'd take him to the library every Saturday, where he'd pick out adventure books, his eyes wide with wonder. I'd read to him at night, my voice steady even when I was exhausted. I taught him to tie his shoes, to say please and thank you, to be kind. But somewhere along the way, he'd forgotten those lessons, or maybe Emily had convinced him they didn't matter. Writing it all down felt like reclaiming those memories, like reminding myself that I'd been a good mother, even if he couldn't see it. One day, while rummaging for a light bulb in the upstairs storage closet, I found an old metal trunk Helen used to keep under her sewing machine. It was heavy, rusted, its lock stubborn but yielding to a screwdriver. I pried it open, expecting thread and buttons, maybe some of Helen's old quilting patterns. Instead, I found envelopes, dozens of them, tied with faded ribbon. One had my name in Helen's familiar handwriting, dated nearly 40 years ago. If you're reading this, it means you've come back. I'm sorry you had to. My heart pounded as I unfolded the brittle, yellowed pages. Inside were hospital forms, handwritten notes, and a single photograph of a newborn wrapped in a hospital blanket. Not James. I read the letter 3 times before it sank in. Helen had been a nurse at St. Mary's Hospital, where I gave birth to James. She'd always had doubts. Something off in the nursery that night, a last-minute room switch, a mix-up with the tags. She'd seen a nurse, flustered and overworked, reassign bracelets in the chaos of a busy shift. By the time Helen raised the issue, it was too late. The babies had gone home. She never told me, afraid it would break me, hoping she was wrong. Years later, she found a document in her files, a quiet settlement between the hospital and another family, the Carters. James wasn't my son. My hands trembled as I stared at the photo. The name was William Carter. If this was true, who was James? Who was I to him? I sat on the closet floor, surrounded by Helen's old fabric scraps, and let the weight of it settle. Strangely, I didn't feel grief or rage. I felt free, not because I didn't love James, but because the years of pain, of feeling like a stranger in my own life, suddenly made sense. Maybe his coldness wasn't imagined. Maybe he felt like a stranger too, and maybe I wasn't crazy after all. I thought of all the times he'd pulled away, even as a teenager, how he'd stopped confiding in me after he met Emily, how he'd let her redefine our family. Maybe it wasn't just her influence. Maybe, deep down, we both sensed something was off. That night, I read every paper in that trunk. Helen had kept it all: DNA reports, an affidavit from a retired hospital administrator, a small article about the Carter family, successful, educated, still living in our town. My real son, William, had grown up just a few miles away, in a house with a white picket fence and parents who could send him to college. I carefully folded the letters, placed them in a new envelope, and tucked them into my nightstand drawer. Then I looked in the mirror for a long, long time. My hair was grayer now, my face lined with years of worry, but my eyes were different, clearer, stronger. I didn't recognize the woman staring back, but for the first time in years, I wasn't ashamed of her. She was broken, yes, but she was waking up, and the world had no idea what that meant yet. I spent days poring over the documents, cross-referencing details. Helen's notes were meticulous, written in her neat cursive. She'd tracked down the Carter family years later, confirming William's birth date matched James's, She'd even ordered a discreet DNA test using a sample from James's childhood medical records and a contact at the hospital lab. The results were undeniable. I thought of Helen, my older sister, who'd always been my protector. She'd carried this secret to her grave, leaving it for me to find when I was ready. I wished I could thank her, but all I could do was honor her by facing the truth. There's a kind of silence that doesn't feel peaceful. It feels punishing. That's the silence I lived in for weeks after reading Helen's letter. I didn't know what to do with the truth. I carried it like a live wire, dangerous to touch, impossible to ignore. I didn't reach out to James or look for William. I just existed. Each day, I made a single cup of coffee, the ritual grounding me as I stared out the dusty kitchen window. My reflection in the glass was a stranger. Older, wiser, but lost. The Dorothy who raised James wasn't the same woman who read those letters. That Dorothy was a mother, once a wife, a caregiver, a giver of everything. But who was I without that identity? I started taking long walks through the town, partly to clear my head, partly to feel alive again. I'd pass the old hardware store where I used to buy paint for the house, the library where James and I spent so many Saturdays. Each step felt like reclaiming a piece of myself, but the weight of Helen's letter never left me. One evening, the radiator broke, leaving the apartment chilly. I lit a candle, wrapped myself in blankets, and sat on the couch with the hospital files in my lap. I must have read them 100 times, every line, every signature, every detail. It all checked out. It was real. My real son, William Carter, was born the same night as James, in the same hospital wing. The hospital settled quietly with the Carters, hoping the truth would stay buried. Helen had copied everything before she passed, leaving me the pieces of a stolen truth. I grieved, but not for James. I grieved the time, the moments I could have had with William, birthday parties with homemade cakes, first days of school with carefully packed lunches, scraped knees I could have bandaged, science fairs where I could have cheered. Everything I thought I was doing for my child was meant for someone else. I remembered the nights I stayed up sewing James's Halloween costumes, the mornings I drove him to baseball practice, the way I'd beam when he brought home a good report card. Those moments weren't false, but they were built on a lie. Yet, I didn't hate James. My love for him wasn't biological, it was unconditional, or so I thought. But when someone you raised doesn't defend you, doesn't see you, it forces you to rethink everything. I started visiting the community center, urged by my neighbor Clara, a spry 72-year-old who refused to let me wallow. "Dorothy, you're not dead yet," she'd say, handing me a flyer for the senior group. "Come play bridge with us." I went, reluctantly at first, but the Wednesday meetings became a lifeline. We'd sit around folding tables, sipping weak coffee, playing cards, and sharing stories. There was Margaret, who'd lost her husband to cancer and felt her kids only called when they needed money. There was Henry, a retired mechanic who missed the days when his grandkids would visit. Their stories mirrored mine. Parents who'd given everything, only to feel discarded. I didn't tell them about Helen's letter, but I shared bits of my hurt, and their nods of understanding made me feel less alone. One quiet afternoon, I decided to act. I wasn't ready to confront James, but I could start somewhere small, somewhere safe. I walked into town and stood across the street from a little bakery on Maple Street, Carter's Confections. I'd passed it dozens of times and never noticed. That was William's place. I didn't need to ask. I just knew. He was about 40, with silver-flecked hair, reading glasses perched on his nose, helping a customer pick out pastries. His voice was soft, patient, his posture confident but unassuming. He laughed at something the customer said, a warm, genuine sound that made my chest tighten. I stood across the street, heart pounding, eyes fixed on the son I never knew. And I cried, right there on the sidewalk, not sobbing, just quiet tears rolling down my cheeks, soaking into my coat collar. I didn't go in, not that day, but I came back, day after day. It became a ritual. I'd walk the block, sit on a bench near the corner, pretend to check my phone, or sip coffee from a paper cup, and watch William live the life I wasn't part of. I noticed the way he greeted every customer by name, how he'd sneak extra cookies to kids, how he'd hum old jazz tunes while wiping down counters. It wasn't stalking, it was mourning, but also preparation. I was learning him, piece by piece, the way I'd once learned James. Slowly, I was piecing things together, not just about William, but about the life I'd left behind. While I watched the bakery, I also started noticing James and Emily. I knew their patterns by heart, etched into my memory from years of living in their orbit. Emily posted endlessly on social media, Instagram stories of her perfect life, tagging her favorite brunch spots, yoga studios, and wine tastings. Following their trail was easy, like following breadcrumbs. And what I saw made me sick. They weren't struggling, they were pretending. Emily's business, Emily's elegance, a so-called lifestyle brand, was a sham. She rented office space she couldn't afford, paid for fake followers to boost her online presence, and maxed out credit cards to maintain the illusion of success. James had quit his job as an accountant a year ago, calling it searching for a new purpose. I called it delusion. They were building a house of cards, oblivious to the wind coming their way. I spent evenings digging deeper, using the community center's computer to search public records. I found Emily's LLC paperwork, riddled with inconsistencies. I checked tax records, which showed unpaid filings. I read business reviews, many of which were clearly fabricated. Every post she made was curated, every event a photo op. Designer handbags, curated charcuterie boards, vacations they couldn't afford. Behind it all was debt. Credit card debt, a defaulted personal loan, James's student debt still unpaid after 15 years. They were suffocating, but too proud to admit it, too arrogant to change. I remembered the early days of their marriage, when Emily seemed sweet, when she'd call me Mom and ask for my recipes. But that was before she realized she could reshape James, before she decided I was an inconvenience. I didn't tell anyone what I'd found, not yet. Instead, I started a second journal, different from the first, which was raw with emotion and heartbreak. This one was strategic. Dates, names, business filings, public records. I wrote down every detail, from the date Emily signed a lease for her office to the exact amount of their overdue mortgage payments. I wasn't just grieving anymore. I was planning. They thought I was gone, invisible, irrelevant. But I was more present than ever, and I was about to remind them exactly who I was. One night, I sat with Clara at the community center, sharing a plate of oatmeal cookies she'd baked. "You've got a fire in you, Dorothy," she said, squinting at me over her glasses. "What's got you so focused?" I smiled, deflecting, just sorting out some old business. But her words stayed with me. Fire. I hadn't felt that in years, not since I was a young mother fighting to give James a better life. Now, that fire was back, and it wasn't loud or destructive. It was steady, like a hearth that could warm a home or burn it down, depending on how you tended it. The first time I saw William up close, I couldn't speak. It was a rainy day, the bakery nearly empty. He was restocking the pastry case, humming an old Nat King Cole tune my mother used to love. Unforgettable. A song that now felt like a cruel irony. I'd lingered outside too long, my umbrella dripping onto the sidewalk, and when he looked up through the window, our eyes met. He gave a polite, welcoming smile, the kind you offer a stranger. That's what I was to him, a stranger. My heart clenched, a sharp pain that rivaled the ache in my joints. I turned away, pretending to check my phone, but my hands shook too hard to fake it convincingly. I drove home, tears falling before I could shut the door. I sat on the couch, clutching Helen's letter, and asked myself questions I couldn't answer. How do you tell someone their entire life began with a mistake? How do you look a grown man in the eye and say, "You're not who you think you are, and neither am I"? I read the letter again, 3 more times, tracing Helen's words with my finger. She hadn't just uncovered the truth, she'd investigated it. The name William Carter wasn't a guess. It was confirmed through hospital records, a DNA test, and a settlement that ensured the Carters' silence. The hospital never told me because I was never meant to know. The Carters must have known something, enough to accept a quiet payout and move on with their lives. But I wasn't here for revenge against them. I just wanted to know him, to see if the ache in my chest could be filled by who he was. So, I went back to the bakery. I started small. I bought a box of butter cookies, their golden edges reminding me of my mother's recipe. William rang them up himself. "Great choice," he said with a smile. "These are my mom's recipe, best in town." His voice was warm, familiar in a way that made my throat tighten. His fingers brushed mine as he handed me the bag, a fleeting touch that felt like a lifeline. I nodded, my voice unsteady. "You own this place?" I asked. "Sort of," he said, adjusting his glasses. "My parents helped me start it. They're retired now, so I keep it going. Keeps me out of trouble." He chuckled, and I managed a small laugh. Of course they helped him. Of course he had support, not like James, who had only my blood, sweat, and sacrifice, and who turned around and made me a punchline. William had parents, but not me. James had me, but never valued what I gave. I started visiting the bakery every few days, sometimes buying a pastry, sometimes just browsing the display case, pretending to debate between scones and muffins. William began to recognize me. "Back again," he'd say with that easy smile, his eyes crinkling at the corners. We made small talk. Weather, baked goods, the town's fall festival, where he'd be selling his famous apple tarts. I never told him my name, not yet. It wasn't time. But each conversation felt like a step closer, a bridge being built over years of distance. One day, he offered me a free cookie, saying, "You're becoming a regular. Gotta keep you happy." I thanked him, my voice catching, and ate the cookie slowly at a corner table, savoring the buttery sweetness and the kindness behind it. Meanwhile, in the shadows of my old life, things were shifting. James sent me one text after weeks of silence. "Mom, you okay?" That's it. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the reply button, but I didn't respond. I had nothing left to say, but I dug deeper into their world. I checked the deed to the house. It was still in my name, a fact that felt like a lifeline. Emily had tried to refinance without my permission and was denied. Her credit score a patchwork of bad decisions. They couldn't afford the mortgage, not with James unemployed, and Emily's business bleeding money. I could have evicted them on the spot, but that would have been too easy. No, I wanted them to feel the slow unraveling, The fear, the realization that the foundation they stood on wasn't just fragile, it was mine. Back at the community center, I found myself opening up more. One Wednesday, over a game of bridge, I told Clara about the dinner, about being called the maid. Her eyes narrowed, her cards forgotten. "That's not right, Dorothy," she said, her voice firm. "You raised that boy. You paid for that house. You don't let them treat you like that." Margaret, sitting across the table, nodded. "My daughter did something similar. Acted like I was just the babysitter for her kids. I had to set her straight." Their words fueled me, reminding me that I wasn't alone. Our generation, those of us who'd lived through wars, recessions, long nights working to feed our kids, had a strength the younger ones didn't grasp. We were patient. We waited. And when we acted, it wasn't an outburst. It was a wave, slow but unstoppable. I started attending other community events, a book club, a knitting circle, even a chair yoga class that left my joints feeling looser. I met women like me, who'd spent their lives giving and were now learning to take back. One woman, Evelyn, shared how she'd sold her family home after her kids took her for granted, using the money to travel to Italy. "Best decision I ever made," she said, her eyes sparkling. I listened, storing their stories like treasures, each one a reminder that I could rewrite my own ending. Every night, I wrote in my new journal, the one that wasn't about pain, but about power. It was meticulous. Receipts, conversations, every time William mentioned a hobby, he loved gardening, a favorite pastry, lemon bars, a childhood memory, building model airplanes with his dad. I wrote it down, not to use against him, but to understand the son I never raised. And between the lines, I saw the truth more clearly than ever. James didn't treat me poorly because he was switched at birth. He treated me poorly because he chose to, because Emily gave him permission to, because somewhere along the line, he stopped seeing me as someone to respect and started seeing me as someone to dismiss. But William, who didn't know me at all, showed me more kindness in 5 minutes than James had in 5 years. I wasn't ready to tell him, not yet, but I was close. And when the time came, I wouldn't just tell him who I was. I'd tell him everything about the hospital, the switch, the life stolen from us both. But first, I had to finish watching the collapse of the life I'd already left behind. I spent hours at the library using their computers to research Emily's business. I found complaints filed with the Better Business Bureau, unpaid vendor invoices, even a lawsuit from a former client who claimed Emily had faked her credentials. I printed everything, organizing it into a folder I kept locked in my desk. I wasn't sure what I'd do with it yet, but knowledge was power, and I was done being powerless. I remembered the advice my father gave me years ago. "Dorothy, always know more than they think you do." I was living that now, and it felt good. I never planned to become a shadow in my own story, but sometimes the only way to see people clearly is to step out of the light. After that day at the bakery, something shifted inside me. Not suddenly, but like a slow sunrise creeping across a frozen field. I wasn't rushing. I wasn't just trying to reconnect with a son I never knew. I was reclaiming myself. I began walking a little taller, speaking a little stronger. I bought a secondhand laptop from the local thrift store, its keys clacking as I typed my notes into files. Evidence, timelines, names. This wasn't a diary anymore. It was strategy, survival. I called a lawyer, not for revenge, but for justice. I wanted the house sold. I had every legal right. I made the down payment, paid every bill, never signed it over. James always said, "We'll put it in your name later, Mom." No rush. No rush for him, because I was covering everything. Now I wanted my name back, my rights, my home, if not physically, then legally. I met with a female attorney downtown about my age, with a no-nonsense demeanor that reminded me of Helen. Her name was Susan, and she listened without judgment as I told her everything. The dinner, the keys, the years of being taken for granted. She nodded slowly, her pen tapping the desk. "We'll file the motion this week. You've got a strong case, Dorothy. That house is yours." I signed the papers with a steady hand, my signature as firm as it was when I bought the house 30 years ago. That evening, I drove past the house, slowing but not stopping. The porch light was on, casting a warm glow over the swing where Emily sat, scrolling her phone, a wine glass in hand. Inside, James was on the couch, playing video games, the flickering light of the TV reflecting off the windows. Their lives were on autopilot, unaware the ground beneath them was shifting. This wasn't about punishing them. It was about restoring balance. And when the house sold, they'd feel what I'd felt for years. Powerless. Maybe, just maybe, they'd understand what it meant to be discarded. I've always believed silence is stronger than noise. That true strength isn't in how loudly you fight, but in how deeply you know you're right. The day the official notice went out to James and Emily, I sat at a cafe near the courthouse, stirring honey into my tea with a calm I hadn't felt in years. Susan, my lawyer, had assured me they'd receive it by morning. My phone buzzed. James. I stared at the screen until it stopped, then turned it over, letting silence speak. I didn't want to hear his voice, not because I didn't care, but because I wasn't ready to hear him lie. That afternoon, I checked my email. James had sent a short message. "Mom, what are you doing? Please call me. Emily's freaking out." Of course she was. The mortgage was due, and they couldn't refinance because the person they thought was too weak to matter held the deed. They never saw it coming. I imagined Emily pacing their kitchen, her perfect composure cracking, while James tried to make sense of a reality where I wasn't there to fix everything. I didn't reply. I'd spent years answering their calls, solving their problems, paying their way. Not anymore. A week later, Emily called. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail, her tone tight, barely controlled. "Dorothy, we really need to talk. This is all a misunderstanding. James says you're going through something, and we're here to support you, but you're putting our lives at risk, and that's not fair." I listened twice, my lips pressing into a thin line. She called the house hers, as if my decades of payments were nothing. My silence grew sharper, more deliberate. They didn't understand yet, but they would. 2 days later, James showed up at my apartment. I saw him through the peephole. Hair uncombed, dark circles under his eyes, a man unraveling. I didn't open the door. He stood there for a long time, knocked once, then again, then said, "Mom, please don't do this." His voice broke, and for a moment, I saw the boy he used to be, the one who'd cling to me during thunderstorms. I stood on the other side, hand on the knob, but I didn't turn it. I let him feel the discomfort of being unheard, just as I had for years. He left after 20 minutes, his footsteps fading down the hall. I leaned against the door, my heart heavy, but resolute. The next week, Susan finalized the paperwork to list the house. I'd get the full profit, every cent, legally, ethically, emotionally. Emily tried to fight it, claiming contribution of value because she'd redecorated the living room. Susan smiled, her eyes gleaming. "Let her prove it in court." "She won't." Emily couldn't, because she'd never invested in anything but appearances. New curtains, a trendy rug, all bought with credit cards she couldn't pay off. And now those appearances were crumbling, one filter at a time. Word spread through the town, as it always does in small communities. Emily's parents, who'd once clinked wine glasses in my kitchen, stopped commenting on her social media. Clients backed out of her workshops, citing unreliable service. She posted a video on Instagram, her voice shaky, talking about the unfairness of generational property law and how she was being victimized. People saw through it, leaving comments like, "Pay your own bills," and "Respect your elders." I didn't post a thing. I didn't need to. The truth was doing the work for me. I kept showing up at William's bakery, my visits becoming a quiet ritual. We had coffee again, sitting at a small table by the window, talking about an old novel we both loved, To Kill a Mockingbird. He said he admired Atticus Finch's quiet strength, and I nodded, thinking how much William resembled that ideal. He recommended a memoir, saying, "It's about grief, but also forgiveness. I think you'd like it." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Maybe I would," I said, "but not yet." I wasn't done grieving or forgiving, but his kindness was a balm, soothing wounds I'd carried too long. One afternoon, he invited me to stay for a baking demo he was hosting for a local school group. I watched as he taught a dozen kids how to roll dough, his patience endless even when flour ended up everywhere. One little girl, maybe 7, hugged him before leaving, and he ruffled her hair, grinning. I sat in the back, my eyes misty, imagining what it would have been like to see him grow up, to be the one cheering at his school plays or tucking him in at night. But I was here now, and that was enough, for now. At home, I boxed up old photos. James as a baby, his chubby cheeks smeared with birthday cake, school portraits with his crooked smile. Birthday parties where I did all the work and got none of the credit. I didn't throw them out, but I put them in a storage bin, closing the lid on a life that no longer fit. The woman who'd spent her life giving everything was gone. The woman who took her place wasn't angry. She was awake. I started writing again, not just journals, but stories, memories of my childhood, my parents' farm, the dreams I'd set aside. I wasn't sure if I'd ever publish them, but putting them on paper felt like reclaiming my voice. The house went on the market, and offers came in quickly. Susan called to say we'd likely get above asking price. I nodded, feeling a weight lift. Across town, in that green-painted bakery, my real son laughed at something a customer said, completely unaware that his life was about to change too, but in the best way. Because not all losses are tragedies. Some are beginnings in disguise. As the weeks passed, I found peace in small things. Morning coffee with Clara, knitting scarves for the community center's winter drive, watching William from afar. I didn't need James to apologize or Emily to crumble. I didn't need William to call me Mom. I needed to know I was enough, and for the first time, I did. I'd given my life to a family that didn't see me, but now I was giving it to myself. And that, I realized, was the greatest gift of all. I walked through my old neighborhood one last time before the house sale closed, not to haunt it, but to say goodbye. I passed the school where James had learned to read, the park where I'd pushed him on swings, the grocery store where I'd counted coupons to afford his favorite cereal. I let it all go because I'd given everything I had to a family that didn't give back. Now, I was giving to someone who might never call me Mom, but looked at me with kindness, with curiosity, with respect. Sometimes you don't need redemption. You just need peace. And I was finally starting to feel it. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, and please share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.